Welcome to the Positive Leadership Podcast. Today, we'll explore a question that has intrigued philosophers, scientists, and leaders alike. What truly makes a good life? Our guest is a psychologist, researcher, and associate director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development. He has dedicated a large part of his career to uncovering answers to this big question through a unique lens. A study spanning over 8 decades, one of the longest running research projects in the world ever done. He has co-authored a book that distills the lessons learned from this extraordinary research that he has taken on and reveals practical ways to lead a fulfilling life. But beyond this research, he's also passionate about understanding how relationships, purpose, and well-being intersect, offering transformative insights for leaders and individuals alike. So I'm delighted to host today Marc Schulz. A very warm welcome, Marc, to this podcast.
Oh, thank you, JP. Excited to be with you today.
So, Marc, such a pleasure again to have you with us on this important discussion. What is a good life, actually? So I'd like to start with your personal journey, if you don't mind. I'd like to know where my guests come from and what was their background and the way that background may have influenced somehow their minds, their mindset, and what they did. So as you reflect on your childhood and your roots, either in your family or throughout your scholarship as well, what have been the key relationships actually that really, early on in your life have shaped maybe your career or who you are as a person today, Marc?
Yeah, such an important question, and certainly thought about it a little bit. So, my parents were really important. I grew up in and around New York City. My father was a refugee from Germany, and his experiences were really quite present in my childhood and important because my father chose to talk about it a lot. And we can talk more about that, but that gave me a sense of how important history was and also a sense of how challenges can really alter people's paths and lives. And it's the way we kind of meet those challenges. And just maybe as a prelude to saying more, my father was only alive and made it to the United States because of connections that he had with other people. So that was an important value that was instilled in me quite early. My father was also quite logical and loved learning. I think that was one of his ways of trying to address some of the real traumas that he was exposed to as a young kid. My mom was quite different. So I like to say I grew up in a cross-cultural home, even though they shared some of those cultural backgrounds, but they were very different. My mom was an artist, much more emotional, less logical than my dad. And my parents were different enough that their marriage lasted all of 2 years. So I was the product of that marriage. They both created new families, and those families were very different. And as a kid growing up, I had to navigate between those two families. And I think that created part of my interest in learning about other people and observing others, which I continue to do today. So those were important influences. I want to add that my mom was a photographer and she was an observer of people. And she also did some teaching early on. She taught in elementary school and eventually she taught in colleges as well. But she was a person who invested in relationships and really observed people through the lens of a camera. That was the most comfortable way for her to do it. And I think probably my observing of people through research, and I'm also a clinician, I work with patients, that those are things that I learned in part from my mother, the excitement of watching people as I grew up. So that's the beginning. I studied sociology when I was in college. I was really interested in the big picture and how we get to places where people thrive and flourish, and was interested in thinking about it from afar. And through a little bit of luck and some sort of hard decisions, I ended up pursuing psychology as a graduate student. And that was the best decision I ever made because I got to think about things much more closely. And I think I also grew more comfortable with what that meant in terms of emotions and the challenges of all that. So that's a little bit of how I got to where I am today.
Wonderful. Marc, is it fair to say that when you come from a migrant family with your dad, you tend to truly value those newfound relationships as you move to a new country? Any kind of relationship that come to your mind as you think about your dad and the way, he started to basically get into that American society?
Well, there are two relationships that I remember from my father that were incredibly important. And again, he was a person who felt like others could learn from some of the challenges that he faced. So he was able to, in a wonderful way, share some of those experiences. So the first was actually before he came to the United States. He grew up in a Jewish family in Germany, and was a tough time in the 1930s as he was becoming an adolescent. And
Yeah.
he literally survived because of the generosity of a family that hid him and other members of my family. Otherwise, he would have been deported and ended up in a concentration camp, as many of my other family members did. So he, talked about this connection and the bravery of the people that hid him. That was a story that was important in our family. I've met those people and made a connection with them. So he continued to connect with them even after the war, went back and built the relationship back again with those folks. And then when he was an immigrant to the U.S., he, as sort of a self-made man, he didn't know English when he came to the United States. He was good at math, so he went to a kind of elite math school, a public school, and then managed to go to the city university and eventually went to night school to become a lawyer. And he found a mentor that was also an immigrant and kind of steered him as he developed professionally. And that was a man I also got to know and kind of revered. That was a colleague my dad always talked about with incredible respect and appreciation. So, very important for him and his journey, those connections.
And this friend, as an example, isn't it an example of I would say, a lasting relationship that is going beyond generations in a way? I don't know if he became also a personal relationship to you, Mark, as you grew up.
Yeah, no, I got to know him and have pictures of going to visit my dad in his office and seeing, this mentor and revered man. It was a lasting relationship. It was important. And I think particularly, you alluded to kind of immigration experiences and how important relationships are. They're important for all of us, but I think when our roots get pulled out from under us, those connections become even more important, right? So for my father, having those people involved in his life in a kind of continuous way, knowing they were there when he had challenges, really important. He was, for a while, this is a more complicated story, but my grandmother had to stay behind. They were reunited 2 years later, but for a while it wasn't clear he would be reunited with his mother. His dad had already died. My grandfather had passed away. So those connections to adults, incredibly important. And as I think about it, they're more, JP. Another person comes to mind for my father as well. He was good somehow at making those connections. I'm not sure he was aware of it, but that was really important to him. Yeah.
And do you think that, again, that the fact that, of course, you lived through that time with your dad, but also your mom, as you said, through the lens of photographer, got you the impulse to become a psychologist? What and how did you come up with that idea?
I think, some of it was experience and some of it, as, always, was probably predetermined. I just couldn't figure it out. It took me a long time to figure out that psychology was a good path for me. But I was always someone who liked to sit back and observe. I played a lot of sports when I was a kid, and my favorite thing to do was to kind of take in the whole field and kind of understand what people's strengths were and why they liked playing in that particular position. And I had some leadership responsibilities on some of those teams. So I was a person who really enjoyed trying to understand what made people tick, and probably was most comfortable pulled back a little bit as opposed to fully engaged sometimes in activities. So I think that was temperamental in part. And then I think this experience of growing up in two families, as I suggested, was really important. I had to adapt. So the best example I can give you is I never in my life heard my father curse, never heard him utter a curse word. My mother, second generation New Yorker, she used curses a lot. And there were different rules in the two houses that I lived in. And I adapted to those rules, but I also grew interested. Why was it that there were these different rules and, different ways of handling conflict? So I think I had a lot of experiences early on that prepared me well to be a psychologist. But I also think when I was younger, stuff seemed too scary, thinking about people's inner life fully and the challenges that they faced. That seemed intimidating and scary. It took a while for me to figure out that I could be comfortable and good at doing that as well.
Very interesting. Can you expand a little bit now on your early career experiences?
Yeah.
Some of the things you did, you just mentioned as
Yeah. So,
examples, sports, but what about
yeah. So,
jobs and activities as well that form you?
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. So I was really interested in trying to figure out a path in which I felt like I could make a difference in people's lives. And
Yeah.
I was studying sociology and political theory. I also took a lot of science courses. Originally, I thought I
Okay.
would be a neuroscientist, and then I just grew enamored with the social sciences. And I had a series of jobs working in settings in which I was trying to help people. So I did some community organizing work. I
Mm.
worked in foundations, trying to help kids who were facing real challenges or disadvantage. I worked in public policy organizations, writing policy memos and trying to draft memos for folks that were in front of the public in some ways. So I was a professional writer for a while. And what I realized is I really got excited by that work, but I also felt like I wasn't always as connected to people as I wanted to be.
Yeah.
Writing is generally a lonely task, and I
Yes.
like being with people and working collaboratively. So I started to think about alternative paths, and this part is complicated, but I started doing some volunteer work in which I were in
Mm.
settings in which people were facing serious mental health challenges, and realized that it was interesting to me as opposed to only scary, which is what I thought about before. And I applied and got into graduate school, and it took me a while. It took me probably to my second year to really figure out this was
Yeah.
right for me. And as I
Your
said,
vocation.
absolutely best decision. One of the great advantages of becoming a clinical psychologist is not only do you learn a lot from reading and understanding how to do research, but you're working with people and also working on yourself to be a better person as you're helping people. And I think that led to lots of development for me in my 20s, even early 30s, as I continued to do this work.
No, wonderful. Let's obviously let's start talking about this mind-blowing study,
Yeah.
the so-called Harvard study of adult development, which is nothing short of extraordinary again. It's a longitudinal study that has spanned nearly 9 decades now, offering unparalleled insights into what makes a good life, as I said in the introduction. So it's really a privilege to discuss with you, Mark, today, given, of course, your leadership in continuing this monumental work.
Yeah.
So, can you introduce our listeners to that study and share with us actually the origins? Why was it launched in the first place?
Yeah.
And how it's been conducted over so many decades while
It's
refreshing, I'm sure, the approach all the time.
incredible to be part of this study. So it's a real privilege for me every day to be able to work with the data that we've accumulated from this study. So it started in the late 1930s, which was an interesting time. It started in Boston, still the Depression in the United States, and on the eve of World War II.
Yeah.
So as my dad was struggling for survival, this was a study that began at the very same time. And it actually began as two separate studies, both focused on thriving. So 724 original participants. The original participants were all male. Two-thirds of the original participants were from the poorest neighborhoods of Boston, the inner cities of Boston. They were facing incredible challenges, incredible poverty. They lived in very crowded apartment buildings, tenement buildings, most without running water. And there the question was, how could they survive and flourish in those particularly challenging circumstances? Most were children of immigrants. Most of those parents were fleeing poverty or oppression abroad, mostly from Europe, but some from the Middle East as well. And then the remaining 1/3 of those 724 participants in a very different place in life. They were at Harvard University. It was 4 consecutive classes. And
Mm.
people were interested again in what leads to flourishing. So very privileged circumstances, although not all of these participants came from fancy families. It was a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, but they had all made it to Harvard. And they had great prospects in life, very different than the inner city boys that were also being followed. So both of those cohorts followed very closely. So this was a study
Yeah.
from the beginning. The other remarkable thing was they were really interested in trying to understand what made people tick, what they were thinking about, how they experienced daily life. So it started with intensive interviews, really long interviews, visits to the homes of all 724 participants, interviews with the parents, observations of how they interacted with the parents. And then more standard things like questionnaires regularly,
Yeah.
interviews at least every 10 years over the course of the study, now in its 87th year.
Sure.
And more recently, modern techniques like brain scans and blood
Yeah.
assays to understand what's going on in the body. And
So
the
how
other
many?
important thing, JP, is along
Sorry.
the way, the wives of the original participants became members of the study, and we're now studying 1,315 of their children.
Wow.
So we're on the second generation. Yeah.
So does it mean actually that that the researchers basically build those different waves, right, of research? They build it with the same communities of people and their families along, basically, so we can almost witness a family life 2, 3 generations.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's
Wow.
incredible. Yeah. So we say we're now studying the second generation, but in reality, you're absolutely right, JP, that
So
we
third.
studied the parents of the original participants. We met
Yeah.
them in their homes. The ratings that were done by our researchers back in the 1930s of what the parents were like, still very important to the study.
Hmm.
So we're now studying actively the third generation, and of course, we're collecting data about that next generation as well. So
Hmm.
we're spanning close to 4 generations. Yeah.
What's fascinating as well, Mark, I'd like you to share a little bit that knowledge as well from a pure research standpoint.
Yeah.
How do how did you pass along the different generation researchers? I would say the core of the research, not just the methodology, but the why we do that,
Yep.
and of course the what has to be done. I'm sure has changed over time,
Yep.
but without denying the inception point of that research, without losing the North Star, I guess, which is not necessarily easy.
No, it's not. So there are a bunch of interesting and important questions embedded in what you're asking me
Yeah,
about. One is, I think there have been now 4 generations. I'm part of the fourth generation
of
of
course.
leadership for the study. Bob Waldinger is the director. I'm the associate director. We've been working on the study now for 21 years. So lots of work done before Bob and I were involved. And I have to say, incredible leadership. So this vision about looking at human flourishing, those 2 studies that I described were brought together. That's the
Mm.
Harvard study of adult development, or the 2 studies that were brought together as one. And those cohorts have been followed, together closely throughout their whole life. So I think there's a shared excitement about this focus on human flourishing.
Mm.
So much of medicine generally, psychiatry, psychology is focused on problems and disease
Right.
outcomes. And this was a study that really was early positive psychology. So I'm excited to
Yeah.
talk about it on your podcast about
Yes.
positive leadership. This was really from the beginning trying to focus on what led to good outcomes. What were the
Mm.
qualities that led to people thriving? Not ignoring the challenges. So, World War II
Of
broke
course.
out in the second year of the study.
Mm.
And many of the Harvard men, for example, 91% of them served in the military. So a
Wow.
focus on the challenges that people experience, but also an interest in trying to understand what leads people to succeed despite those challenges.
Mm.
So I think there's a kind of shared investment in that general North Star, if you will, across these 4 generations. And then, longitudinal data that's collected across time, that's what we mean by longitudinal data, is messy
Yep.
because the science changes
Yes.
and people move and sometimes drop out of the study. So there's a kind of excitement for me as a researcher. It's the challenge of figuring out ways to creatively combine ideas and methodologies across these
Mm.
decades in ways that can allow us to answer important questions like, does our childhood experiences, do they relate to how we are as an 80-year-old in our relationship with our intimate partner? I mean, it's so exciting to be able to ask those questions. And then I think more simply, there's a shared appreciation for what we can learn from studying people carefully. So these are a little bit like, it's the family photo collection, but it's on steroids, right? This
Yeah.
is so much data collected on individuals and families. And one of my favorite things to do is to take some time. It's usually a
Mm.
few days to really dive deeply into a particular participant, follow
Mm.
their life, think about what they imagine life might be, and then how it turned out, to reconnect with the worries they had when they were 18, and then to see what they turned out to be when they were in their 60s. So this is a kind of exciting way of doing research.
Yeah.
And I think that there's been a shared excitement across these generations of leadership in this study.
And we'll come back later, obviously, Mark, on the personal bonds I'm sure you've created along the way, because at the end of the day, beyond data and research, there are real people and people's
Yeah.
lives. So let's come back to that. Now, I'd like for you to share a bit more the way you collaborated with your friend who has been doing this research with you. And I think his name is Robert Waldinger,
Waldinger.
right?
Yeah.
Robert Waldinger. And so can you tell us about the close collaboration way it worked?
Yeah.
Because we are a duo, right? The way you kind of share the workload and the combined expertise, and what can we find from the yin and yang from both of you on this research?
Yeah. Love to talk about Bob's and my connection. So Bob and I met about 31 years ago at this point. Bob is a decade older than I am, 11 years actually older than I am. And he was the training director in the institution where I did my initial clinical training. So when you become a clinical psychologist, you have to do a year of clinical internship. And Bob was officially my boss when I did that clinical internship. I turned 30 that year. And Bob and I got to know each other a little bit, but really I got to know his wife, who was one of my clinical supervisors. And she was one of my favorite supervisors. She was just terrific. And then the next year I was doing a research postdoc, and Bob had begun to transition from primarily an administrator and a clinician to becoming a researcher. So in some ways, my boss became my colleague in a kind of odd way. And I had more experience in terms of training in research than Bob did. So there were things that I could bring to the table that he didn't know about, like stats that he was just learning. And there was life experience, and just he's as we would say in Boston, he's wicked smart, Bob. He's a really smart and observant guy. And we had a relationship that flourished first as colleagues, and we started to meet every week for lunch in which we talk about our work and where we were headed, and we'd write grants together. But we also started to talk about our personal lives, and we became friends, and we've maintained that friendship now for, as I said, over 3 decades. You're absolutely right that Bob and I bring different things to the table. And what we like to say is when we work together, that's when the magic happens. So we complement each other really nicely. And there are all sorts of examples. And then there are places where we take different roles. You know, we might go in and out of. So maybe I'm good at seeing the big picture in a particular place, and Bob can do the details. And then we might switch roles in a certain way. But we've been working like that together for quite a long time. And I think particularly rich has been the kind of brainstorming that we do together, that there's a kind of excitement when we're talking with each other about new ideas, new approaches to the research, a way to frame a paper or to write a book together, as we did. We enjoy those conversations immensely. And I think there's an important lesson. We want to be thoughtful about the people we work with, clearly, but we want to enjoy the people that we work with. So part of the reason Bob and I have worked together and done so well is we enjoy being with each other. I think there are strengths, again, that complement each of our potential weaknesses or areas we're not as good at. And that allows us to be motivated enough to, you know, when we do face challenges, when we disagree about something, or, you know, some tension arises, we're motivated to work on that and to address that, as opposed to just ignore it or move on to the next connection. So yeah, in the midst of an 88-year-old study, 87-year-old study, we have a 31-year-old relationship for the two current leaders, and proud of that.
That's wonderful. It's another testament about the deep value of this relationship that both of you form together. I'd like you, Marc, to maybe talk about the most innovative and modern tools you are using these days, or looking forward. I mean, you've been mentioning about brain imaging, maybe genetic analysis. What about neural link? Maybe connecting with most technology in the brains of the people, and AI, of course, because you should have I'm sure you have a huge data platform that you can actually use extensively. So tell us more about the way it's going and the way you want to inform differently your research moving forward.
Yeah, so I would say our way of thinking about this is really guided by an interest in trying to build on what the study is already really good at, which is trying to take information that's very closely connected to the experience of people, and individuals. The trick in research is to build from individual cases to larger samples, right? We have 724 original participants, 1,300 people in this next generation. So the trick is figuring out ways to aggregate across individuals, to develop your understanding of an individual in such a way that you can then combine it with your understanding of many individuals. And there are advances, AI as part of the story, there are advances in the quantified, in the quantitative approaches that we take that have allowed us to do that much more proficiently. And I don't want to get into the details of that, but being able to do this statistically, to follow individuals very closely and observe patterns across their entire lives. For example, how their marriages progress from their 20s into their 80s. We can draw a picture of that trajectory across time. And then if we do this correctly, this is what modern techniques allow us to do. We can combine that picture across the 700 other trajectories that we have of the folks who are married. So that's part of what we're doing, but we're also collecting information in a different way. So we're definitely looking under the hood. We're looking at the brains of individuals as they do tasks that we think are relevant to what leads to people flourishing or not. We're collecting blood, which allows us access to all sorts of information, inflammatory patterns, which are important, particularly as we age. Epigenetics, how genes turn on and off. It allows us to look at certain systems of genes that we think, for example, are related to fighting infection, both viral infections and bacterial infection, and also affect inflammation as well. So we can look at specific genes or groups of genes and look at how they might be turned on or off by life experience, which is incredibly exciting. So one of those life experiences which are important to us are connections to others. And if you're lonely, those genes that I talked about, the pro-inflammatory genes get turned up, you have more inflammation, and your ability to fight infection, the genes involved in that, they get turned down, so you're more vulnerable to infection. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. I think we're also using, technology's changed everything in certain ways. So we're able to do things in the lab that simulate real life in different ways too. So we bring people into the lab. Psychologists often do cruel things to the participants. We stress them out in the lab. We make them imagine they're doing a public speaking task, which is the easiest way to stress out anyone. And if they're not worried about that, we have them do very difficult arithmetic tasks. And we say, JP, you're not going fast enough. You got to go faster. So we get people stressed and we're monitoring their body, and we're interested in how quickly their bodies can recover. Not just how stressed they get, but how quickly their bodies can return to equilibrium. So these are modern techniques that add to this incredible corpus of data. And part of what's exciting about it, so in the second generation, we know a little bit about their parents, a lot about their parents.
Of course. And
maybe we can connect how they do in the lab when we stress them out to knowing a little bit about their experiences growing up in this family. And we've done that.
It's amazing. Any kind of predictive analytics, as we call it, in the field of AI, where you could dare projecting maybe the happiness of people.
Yeah, we're talking about that. So the closest we're getting to taking advantage of some of the recent technological advances in computing and sort of data analysis is really looking at this incredible, if you think about all the words we've collected from participants, we have an incredible text-based corpus of information on people. So we're working with folks who are expert at analyzing texts, and a lot of those approaches use machine learning and AI techniques and trying to understand different ways than psychologists have traditionally used to quantify things like well-being. Instead of just asking people how they feel about life, are they satisfied, we can look at their responses to a bunch of questions and begin to get kind of archetypes of what it might be, what it might look like, the words may look like for a flourishing person versus not. And that certainly allows us to begin to make predictions as we move forward. But I would say that's probably the area that we're most excited about right now, given how much information we have about folks.
No, it's pretty amazing, Marc. So before we dive into, of course, the key learning, the takeaways, and the way they've been evolving over the decades, can you at least share one of those very personal stories of people, participants, that touch you in your 20 plus years of research, more than that, actually.
So I always
really, top of your mind, or your heart, maybe as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's sort of true. There's a kind of aphorism around that, all people are interesting if you look hard enough, and there's some truth to that here. Like, it's extraordinary reading through these stories. But there's one person who we talk about in our book, The Good Life, and he lives a life that's really a life filled with connection that I'll talk about. We call him Leo. Leo grew up in Vermont, in a pretty rural community, middle class, upper middle class family. Good student, not great. He was an athlete, but he became inspired when he was in high school by an English teacher, by a particular teacher. And we hear stories about this all the time in the sample, about inspiring teachers in particular in their life. He went to Harvard. Harvard, he really became quite engaged. He was a pretty spectacular writer and an observer of people. And he studied history, and he was interested in being a writer, observing. World War II broke out. Like many of the men in the study, he volunteered to serve in the military. He served in the Navy in the South Pacific and Asia, in combat role for several years. During the war, his dad passed away, unfortunately. And at the very end of the war, it became clear that something was going on with his mom, and that something turned out to be Parkinson's disease. He had taken very careful notes during the war of his experiences. So he did journals, and he was hoping to write a book or to publish a big article about his experiences. He ran back to Vermont to help his family and ended up staying in Vermont for the rest of his life. 6 months after he was there, he had a job at a local high school just out of convenience. He was teaching history. He met the love of his life, the woman who he became married to and remained married throughout his life. That was his language, the love of his life. Never became a writer. He became a high school teacher, but he was a beloved high school teacher. Students loved him, generations upon generations. His colleagues valued his input and guidance. He was asked continuously to assume administrative posts to become a leader, but he loved teaching so much he didn't want to do that, or he only wanted to do it for part of his time. So he became a kind of pillar of his community, embedded in the school, training generations of teachers and students. He also developed a family with his wife, the love of his life, a family that was very close and connected. They would call him out when he was distracted, maybe worrying about that grading that was piling up. They would call him out, say, Dad, we want you to pay attention. He would talk about this. Sometimes I need to be reminded. But when he paid attention, he was interested in other people. This was the experience of Leo through his life. He was quite connected to his family. When he retired, his grandkids were an important part of his life. He taught them things that he loved. Fishing and being on boats was important to him. So this was an example of a Harvard graduate with ambitions to be a famous writer, never got to be a writer, was a country teacher, but a beloved one, connected to many, and lived a very fulfilling and life that he would say was very happy.
A wonderful story, Mark. And now let's get actually with that wonderful example about the key insight from the Harvard study, which is all about defining relationships, whether they are family relationships, romantic, platonic, friends. They are the cornerstone and basically the most important predictors of happiness, of well-being, and health on top of that. So can you unpack this critical insight? Because I think there's a lot about it. It's about relationship. And what are the social, emotional benefits of strong connections? And how do they actually shape our own well-being? And what is very special about them?
Yeah, so we started this journey, Bob Waldinger and I, about 5 years ago. Bob had actually done a TED Talk in which he, a TED Talk, you have to take science or take knowledge and deliver it in a way that's going to be accessible to others. And I remember poorest prediction I ever made in my life. Bob had a draft of the TED Talk. He asked me to listen to it. And I said to Bob, I think this could work, is what I said. That TED Talk is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. It's an extraordinary talk. And what Bob did there is that we had begun to do this together. We had reviewed, the hundreds of papers from the study, the more than 15 books at that time that had been written. And there was a signal there around relationships. They were the most reliable predictor of a whole bunch of things, not just our emotional well-being, but our physical well-being.
Physical as well.
And then we said, well, maybe that's something peculiar about the study. Every study has its idiosyncratic pieces. The study started over 80 years ago. We need to look at other literatures and to see whether people are finding the same thing. And that's what we did in our book, The Good Life. We looked across thousands of studies. And it's very clear. The summary of that book is one that I'm still very comfortable with, and it's simple. Relationships keep us happy and healthy throughout the lifespan. Now, the question is why? You asked JP, what are the social and emotional benefits of relationships? And that's the key. Relationships, it turns out, when we study them, give us so many things. I can start with things maybe we take for granted that we don't recognize sometimes. They help us figure out who we are in relationships, not just our romantic partners, but our friends, people that we work with. They help us figure out who we are, what we're good at, the kind of person that we want to be. They connect us with our past. So old friends are important. Relatives are important because they connect us to our past. They give us a sense of continuity. In that same way, they add to our identity. There are places where we experience our strongest feelings, both positive and negative. So I'll start with the positive side. Our greatest joys we typically experience in the presence of others that we care about. And our greatest achievements are most important when we can share them with people that we care about. Achievement by itself is lonely, and it turns out not as exciting and not as meaningful unless we can share it with people that might appreciate it and be proud of what we've done. And maybe the most important is that relationships help us in a number of different ways when we face challenge in our life. So when we face adversity or stress or trauma, relationships are an incredible resource for us to navigate those challenges. They help us deal with the many feelings that those challenges might engender. They help us think about a path forward. They help check us about whether we're seeing things realistically or missing something important. So my wife will say to me, Mark, you're missing something here. Your colleague is interested in more than just making your life difficult here. You're missing something, right?
Yeah.
That's what a good relationship will help us do. More mundane, they remind us to do the important things to take care of our health. Have you gone to the doctor? Are you exercising these days? Seems like you lost some weight. Good for you. Have you been working at that? So it turns out that relationships give us very practical things, and then things that are in some ways harder to measure, but we're beginning to recognize more and more through interesting and creative research. They help our bodies navigate stress. They literally calm our bodies down in ways that are really important if we're going to thrive.
No, it's a wonderful summary again at the very top of what a good, more than a good, a meaningful relationship is all about. Now, I like Mark to talk about importance of relationships in a context of a conversation I had with someone I'm sure you know, Barbara Fredrickson. She was on my podcast 18 months ago. She's the author of a wonderful book called Love 2.0, Creating Happiness and Health in Moments of Connection. And what I remind of discussion, of course, is the concept of micro moments of love and connection, which are those brief but powerful moments where sometimes we bump into even someone we don't even know for the first time ever. But those moments are important too. So how do you consider these fleeting moments complementing or contrasting with the enduring relationships studied in Harvard Project? Do they matter? And how do you position that?
They do matter. It all matters. I love the connection with Barbara Fredrickson. She and I were in Berkeley at the same time. I was a graduate student. He was a postdoc, as when we got to spend some time together. And this interest in micro moments we shared at that moment. We had conversations about it. So it's all important. Obviously, the connections that we sustain across time have the most influence on us. It's most critical. In our study, we asked folks, in the middle of the night, if you're scared or sick, is there someone you can call? That question turns out to be really important. It's one of the key functions of relationships. In times of challenge, do you have people who have your back?
Who do you call?
Who do you call? Who do you reach out to, right?
Yes. So
that's not to say, though, these micro experiences that you're talking about are not important. And they're important for a bunch of reasons. One is there's a experience of joy and positivity that some of Barbara Fredrickson's research suggests is exactly the way that we undo some of the problems that we experience when we have stress, when our bodies experience stress. So positive emotions undo the experience of negative emotions in many ways. So it's important that we have these moments of uplift and connection with other people. They also remind us, and I think this is a critical function that they serve, they remind us that the world is larger than ourselves, and particularly larger than those voices that we have in our head that tell us to worry about, are we really connecting with this person? Is the other person interested in us? When we have a moment of connection, a moment of shared joy, it's an experience that we're bigger than ourselves, that there's a collective that goes beyond our bodies. And those connections are really important. And I think they're motivating for us, that we want more of them because it feels good. So I went to a concert the other night, and the experience of being with people in front of music collectively, such an incredible experience. And coming out of that, I think about how beautiful the music was. I think about how much fun it was to be with other people and that excitement, but it makes me want to be with people more. So one of the things that these micro moments serve is they motivate us, I think, to continue to make those connections. So I like to say it's relationships we said are important to your health and your emotional well-being. And people immediately say, well, what kinds, right? And it's all kinds. And it includes those encounters with what we used to call sort of weak ties, people that aren't central parts of our relationship connections. But those can be incredibly powerful as well, right? Having a conversation with someone who you see every day, but never talk to, boy, can that be exciting. Really exciting. Yeah.
No, I love the way you talk about it, Mark. And it makes me think about, something at least that I believe deeply about, which is shared memories, the way we build shared memories with people and, again, lasting relationships. And the fact that when we get together again, sometimes 30 years after, it's still there. It's still an important moment of our lives that we share.
That's right. It's shared memories and it's shared emotion as well. Like it's memories tinged with emotion or the things that we remember. And it's those feelings we want to get back. And it's incredible. I'm lucky enough to have friends that I've known since I'm 3 years old, literally, that I'm still friends with. And, we can get together and we can giggle like we did when we were 5 years old. What a great feeling, right, to have. Yeah.
So, Mark, I'd like to continue and make another reference as I prepare this episode. I was thinking about a Netflix series I watched a few years back and a book which was authored by Dan Buettner called Blue Zones. I'm sure you're familiar with Blue Zones. And so for our listeners, Blue Zones is about communities where people live exceptionally long lives. And the author talks about the power of 9. He identified 9 common lifestyles characteristics among the Blue Zone inhabitants. And so basically the idea is that environment matters. Longevity is more about creating the right environment than individual choices. So Blue Zone inhabitants didn't actively pursue longevity, their environment fostered it. And it's all about diet, exercise, purpose, and relationships and more. So in your view, how do factors like environment, lifestyle, and purpose as well interact with the role of relationships in fostering, again, well-being and a happy life?
So I think that the Blue Zone approach, Dan Buettner's approach, sort of two real strengths. One is that it recognizes the power of connection, both at the relationship level and at the community level. And that's something that our research is showing and so many other researchers around the world. I think the other kind of seminal idea, which is an idea that's been popular in other places, but the Blue Zone method, the way it was framed, was appealing and accessible to lots of people. And that's this idea that, again, there's something beyond ourselves. We position ourselves in environments and ecologies that shape our behavior in important ways. So, what Dan Buettner's talking about in Blue Zones are places where people are walking a lot. People are connecting. They're going to markets and connecting with other people in the community. Our Surgeon General in the United States 2 years ago talked about a crisis and disconnection, issued a public health advisory akin to smoking causes cancer, that loneliness is leading to premature death and disease. And part of what he talked about, this was work that he collected from other academics. Holt Lundstedt is an important part of that, her work on loneliness. He talked about the importance of developing social infrastructure that encourages connection and collaboration. And the Blue Zone idea very much embraced that. It looked at communities in which that unfolded in a natural way, that there were reasons why people came together. In the States, for decades, people have been talking about the decline of communities and the fact that people don't spend time together.
Yep.
Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which was, I think, around 2000, talked about the fact that people just aren't participating in civic activities and social activities that lead to those connections. So those environments are critical. And I think part of what we're trying to do to combat loneliness, which is a major public health problem across many countries, is to figure out new ways to build this social infrastructure that brings people together. So one concrete example, JP, gardens are beautiful. We have some beautiful gardens in Pennsylvania where I live outside Philadelphia. But even better are community gardens in which you're digging next to someone. And you get to glance over and say, your vegetables are thriving, mine are dying. What are you doing differently, right? So that fosters connections in important ways. So we need to build collective environments in which people are doing things in close proximity to others, and they can build relationships in those communities.
That's wonderful. It makes me think about actually one example coming to my mind, Mark, is example of a young female social entrepreneur of my community from my foundation, Live for Good. She's business south of France, and she built a service where she connects aging people shopping in the hypermarkets where they're only ones to shop. It's a very lonesome activity with youth, and basically becoming their companions of shopping. And it created wonderful relationships. For the 30 minutes they go shopping, in a way, it became a goal for those aging people to reconnect with youth. And it's one example among many where I think we can be creative about creating those social bonds.
Exactly. I love that. And, the more different, this is intergenerational, the more different those connections are, the more we have to learn. So there's a lot that young people have to learn from older people and vice versa. I'm a university professor. The amount, and I keep learning from young people, right? The number of things they've taught me over the years. I'm just so lucky to be in that environment where I can connect with young people. In your work over the years, I'm sure that was true for you. When we bring in people that are different than ourselves, we have the opportunity to grow and learn in ways that are just incredible and incredibly valuable. Yeah,
absolutely. So, Mark, I'd like now to really dig a little bit into the social infrastructure of the study, because in many ways, when you think about such happiness studies, there's been many much more superficial studies about how much money is important to happiness. And so, from your observation over the past many years at the Harvard study, do you see any difference based on the social economics background, social demographics, right, of your participants? In other words, well, does happiness actually correlate with how much money you have in your bank account? Or not really?
So I'm going to answer within our study, and then I want to talk about the broader literature, because I think it's important, again, that we talk about replication. In our study, there's no connection. There is a connection between socioeconomic background and how long you live. So there are health disparities that are linked to financial backgrounds that are quite large. And I'm going to say this concretely and clearly because it's distressing. Inner city boys compared to the Harvard men, they live on average 10 years less than those Harvard men. So their lifespans are much shorter. 10 years, huge difference.
10 years.
And we see this persisting in the United States. I think the current figure is college educated live 9 years longer than non-college educated in the United States. So health disparities, very clear and persistent. When we're talking about emotional well-being, folks from the Boston sample are as happy in their adult life as folks from the Harvard sample. If we look at income level and our various measures of how well people are flourishing or their self-reported happiness, no connection in our study.
No connection.
In other studies, the clearest signal, the most replicated signal is up to a middle-class income. Income seems to matter. And the reason we think it matters is that it gives you security in life. It gives you shelter that's safe, access to food, access to healthcare, some predictability, particularly if there are challenges, there's something you can fall back on. So famous study in the US, it was $74,000, which at that time was the average income in the United States. There's a small relationship as you get wealthier, as you earn more income,
Yep.
slight increases in happiness. After
Hmm.
that, studies disagree. There's some
Disagree.
studies that suggest there is a relationship. If there is a relationship, it's small. And what do I
Small.
mean by small? It means that you really have to double or triple your income, which most people aren't able to do, in order to get a small advance in your happiness or satisfaction of your
Hmm.
life.
Hmm. Hmm.
So the conclusion I take away from that, it's clear
Yep.
that there are very wealthy people that are miserable. There are also
Yes.
very impoverished people that somehow have
Hmm.
a kind of sense of meaning and purpose and
Yep.
joy in their life. They're able to do that. And that
Yep.
money is not the most important thing here.
Thanks for reminding us the reality of happiness, Marc. As we navigate a rapidly changing world, one of the pressing challenges that you mentioned as well is addressing the loneliness epidemic, particularly among younger generations. So, despite being digitally connected, Gen Z, as we call it, right, consistently reports feeling this loneliness. A study recently by the Cigna Group in 2023 highlights this stark reality. Gen Z adults are still the loneliest, with 71% feeling lonely, followed by millennials, 65%, Gen X, 59%, and baby boomers, 44%. So those Gen Z individuals report feeling lonely often or always, making them the loneliest generation despite being digitally connected like never before, right? Increased time spent on, again, social media can decrease opportunities for meaningful relationships, I believe. And recently, Jonathan Hart's work on Gen Z explored those topics as well in the anxious generation. I don't know if you heard about and read this
Of
book. He
course, yeah,
delves
yeah.
into the alarming rise in mental health issues among, again, adolescents, particularly since the early 2010s. And it attributes the surge to the pervasive use, again, of smartphones, social media, coupled with shifts in parenting styles as well and societal norms. So, given those modern challenges of loneliness and the impact of digital culture, social media, now Gen AI as well with ChatGPT, how do the insights from the Harvard study provide guidance or
Yeah.
solutions? Are there lessons from your findings that could help younger generation foster deeper connections, Mark?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really important question. Again, I spend lots of time with young people, and they report exactly what those data that you're reporting suggests. They're experiencing high rates of loneliness. In a given week in the United States, estimates are between 20 and 50% during the week feel loneliness. So first, we need to be clear about our terms, right, for our listeners.
Yes.
So college students are a very good example. High rates of loneliness, incredible physical proximity to thousands of other people like them,
Yep.
similar interests. You would expect them not to report that they feel lonely. But loneliness isn't physical proximity to others. It's a sense that other people don't know you, don't really care about you, don't care
Don't value
about
you,
how you're doing.
or don't value you
Or
as
don't
well.
value, exactly. So,
Or
our
you,
needs really are simple. We want to be seen and understood and valued.
yep.
And when people say they're lonely, they have a sense that they're kind of outside of other people, outside of society in a way that's demoralizing to them. And folks have talked about this, demoralized as a term that I connected in my head immediately to Max Weber, the famous sociologist. We've talked about this sense of being outside of society for a long time, for centuries, philosophers have talked about it. And somehow in modern
Yep.
society, we've created a condition in which many people feel apart from others. And it's worrisome. And it's worrisome because we need to be clear, it's not just prevalent, but if we think about its risk for physical health problems or premature death, it's on the
Yep.
same order as smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being
Wow.
obese. So we're talking about a major public health challenge. So lessons. One lesson with the second generation, we've been asking lots of questions about their engagement with others and how they do it. Do they do it virtually? Is it in person?
Yep.
How they navigate it during the pandemic? Those are data we're still trying to make sense of. But we've also studied, and others have done this as well, what it's like to talk to people over a video connection as opposed to doing it in person. What it's like to text as the most common source of communication as opposed to in-person communication. And there are a few conclusions that I think are beginning to become common across studies. One is that we experience less emotion when we're talking to people over any of the technologies, including the video-mediated technologies.
Yep.
We feel less close with people. And part of it is we're talking over a video-mediated technology right now, and all I can see is your upper torso,
Small
right?
frame,
I can't see the whole body.
And I'm missing your nonverbal cues as well.
Exactly. The whole nonverbal cues
yeah.
that we tend to unconsciously imitate, right? We find ourselves in conversation with other people. We have our hands folded in the same way, or we're leaning in or leaning out. So it's very hard to do that on Zoom. And the folks that run these technologies, all of them, not just Zoom, are clever. They're trying to make them more lifelike. So when I raise my hand on Zoom now, there's a hand that goes up, but we haven't gotten there yet. So what people feel when they're in the technology mediated world, they feel less close and less connected than they might if they're in person. You described the irony that these technologies allow us to connect in ways that we've never been able to do before. If they weren't around during the pandemic, my Lord, it would have been so much harder, right, to not have those connections. But we've chosen to use them as a substitute for the kinds of connections that we used to have, which were more in person. And this is particularly true for young people. Easy to text, easy to order food so you don't have to go out and be at a restaurant or talk to people. Easy to stream media so you don't have to go to a movie. Going to a movie, I'm afraid, is going to become something that's just not going to happen anymore. Terrible. And yet we all know from going to movies, it's an incredible experience to do that collectively. So I think things have changed. And I think, Jonathan Haidt's work about connecting particularly rates of mental illness and anxiety to some of the technology challenges on the right track. This is really hard data to really make sense of because it's not experimental, and there are lots of other things going on, right? Young people are also worried about climate change. There's incredible political acrimony around. There's uncertainty about the future of the economy. So I think there are probably a number of things going on, but the technologies are certainly playing a role. And the easiest one that we all know about and talk about is that we're creatures of comparison. All of us are. So when I was a kid growing up in a suburb, I'd go outside of my house and I'd look down the street and see what car the neighbors were driving. And I was curious about whether they got a new car and it looked nicer than the car my family had. Today, you don't have to go outside. You just have to pick up your phone and you scroll through social media, but you get a very skewed picture of the world. That's not a representation of what the world is really like. It's a representation of people's greatest moments and the greatest things that they have. So people feel worse generally when they scroll through social media to look at what's happening with other people. It's particularly true for young people and particularly true for young girls or young women. This is pernicious for their mental health. I think that this is an idea that we're beginning to have some evidence, and we need to think about what the solution is here.
So Marc, it's a big, deep discussion indeed. Pretty worrying, but again, maybe another episode in the future, I'd love to explore more that question and the way you can apply some of the learnings you had of the kind of 80 years of study on how to advise youth, right, to recreate or ignite some real relationships with people, real people, warm bodies, right?
I do want to add one thing because you were reminding me, and this is lessons from our research. It's also lessons from others. When we wrote the book, we were really struck by this idea, the language that we use around attention. We pay attention. It's language of commerce, right? That we talk about it as a resource, and yet we don't fully recognize in our daily life how much our attention is being grabbed by things other than what we might value most. So we think relationships are important, and we think that being present and interested in others is how relationships build. But many people have trouble sitting in a room with another person and attending, being present and interested in that other person. There's a distraction that we're all carrying around in our pockets. It vibrates to tell us that something that we think may be important could be happening. So the message here is about being more intentional about our attention. Hard to say that, intentional about our attention. It means not just going on automatic pilot, letting that attention go to screens, especially. It means really using that for the things that are most important in our life. Nothing more painful to me having talked about this in front of many audiences, I expected
Yeah.
middle-aged parents to complain about their children not being able to attend, being distracted by phones. What I've heard some of that, but I've also heard young people who've just had a baby talk about visiting their parents and their parents not being able to put phones down so they could pay attention to their precious grandchild, right? That's a
Wow.
world that somehow we've created. We're all
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah.
And that's an area I think we need to figure out how to do better.
Absolutely, Mark. So another one of the last dimensions I'd like to explore together from the Harvard study is the importance of giving back, right, as a way to create bonds and fulfillment. It made me think about another book that I'm sure you've read, Mark, because you've been reading so many books by Adam Grant, right, where he talks about the takers and the givers. So for the listeners, according to Adam, the takers are people who, when they walk into an interaction with another person, are trying to get as much as possible from that person and contribute as little as they can in return. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a strange breed of people that he calls the givers. And it's not about donating money necessarily or volunteering necessarily, but it's about really looking to help others by making introduction, giving advice, providing mentoring, sharing knowledge without any strings attached. And last but not least, Adam talks about a third group of people who he calls the matchers. A matcher is somebody who basically tries to maintain and balance the give and take. So, what's your perspective on generosity, Mark?
Yeah.
And is it a zero-sum game where essentially everyone needs to match the other's behaviors and give when they take? Did your research found out that actually unlimited philanthropy or acts of service feed some unique and meaningful connections and contribute again to overall well-being and happiness?
They do, right? So this was a generation, when I talk about them again, particularly the students, the Harvard students were of age, that they were military age when World War II happened. 91% of them served. Most of them volunteered to serve. That's just an incredible idea for youth today to imagine.
Yeah.
They talked about this experience as the scariest of their lives. Many of them talked about the horrors of war, that they'd never seen something so horrible. Don't imagine they ever would again. We talked to them right after they came back from the war.
Yeah.
We also talked about it with them later in life, so they look back on it. They also, though, talked about something else. They talked about an incredible sense of purpose, that they thought they were saving the world, that they volunteered to do something because if they didn't, they were afraid the world as they knew it wouldn't exist. So it's that sense of purpose that helped them when they were in those foxholes and their lives were in danger. It was also, this was the other thing they talked about, it was the sense of camaraderie. It was putting their lives in the hands of the person next to them, being able to trust people and to have the connection and closeness that comes from that. So that's one important finding from the study about how that shaped their experience. I would say we know from lots of research that the benefits of giving, and giving can be in many forms. It could be helping other people. It can be giving money to others. It can be sharing wisdom with others. And it can be just telling other people that you appreciate them. JP, you've been asking wonderful questions, right? That's being generous. The giver gets as much, if not more, out of that interaction than the taker. So generosity has benefits for the person being generous. Again, a lot of those benefits, I think, are relational in nature. We have a sense that life is larger than ourselves. It gives us a sense of purpose. I want to say two other things. One is we started the conversation by talking a little bit about the influences in my life. And my mother is an incredibly generous person. She was a teacher for much of her life, in addition to being a photographer. What I remember hearing is my mother always being a kind of mentor, an advisor, having people over, going to people's shows, students who became photographers and going to their shows. And the conversation in our house was sometimes my stepfather would say, "Are they paying you, Anne, to do that? Is that something that you're getting paid for?" And she said, "It's part of my job, but this is the meaning that I get from that job."
Yes.
And I've lived a life in an educational setting in which those are the benefits that I get too. It's watching other people grow, having a sense that I'm contributing perhaps in some meaningful way to them. What an incredible privilege to be in that position. So I think we know that there are clear benefits from that. And it's the very notion that there is a zero sum out there, I think gets us into trouble. So one of the modern challenges, and I'm not sure I'm able to articulate this in the right way yet, but I'm thinking about it a lot. I think young people have so many choices today that they do a lot of calculations about what the benefit of this decision will be for me. And of course, we've done this for centuries, but we have so much more freedom and choice than we've had before that that's a kind of transactional task in which it's the giving part doesn't, it's harder to quantify, right? That it's hard to know the joy and benefit that you get from helping people in your life, whether you're in a business setting, mentoring people, or you're in an educational setting, teaching people. So I think we need to be careful about the way we quantify things as we make these calculations. We talked about money a little while ago. Money is easy to count. Items on a resume are easy to count. Being generous and giving other people your time and attention, much harder to count.
I agree with you. So, Mark, we are coming to the very last couple of questions because time has been flying very fast, fortunately, so much more to ask. And now I'd like to finish with a couple of questions on leadership. And you mentioned something that to me is critical and that I felt all along our discussion, purpose. It's clear that to me, you're a purpose-led researcher, purpose-led author, purpose-led educator. And based on your work and your own passion, Mark, how can leaders basically align their personal purpose with their professional goals to foster what is called a positive leadership? And how developing meaningful professional relationships as well matter in our lives too. Not just to succeed, to take a big job and to get a big check, but to actually have a real meaningful impact in our life.
Yeah, good life for sure. So two thoughts that I have right away. One is, not particularly unique to me, that I think it's important that we all reflect, leaders, all of us, on how well our goals and our purposes are aligning with what we're spending time doing. And we need to do that regularly. So, I don't love to grade. That's part of what I do as a professor. It's not my favorite thing, but I accept that as one of the costs to getting to do all the other things that I really do appreciate. I'm really invested in being a lifelong learner. It's part of my job. It's a great benefit of my job. So I've aligned that part very clearly with what I do on a daily basis. And we all need to do that because it can become misaligned easily. If we're not paying attention, we've sort of gone on autopilot. Very quickly, we are going to end up spending time on things that maybe aren't the most important. So that's one piece of it. I think you're hinting at, and I totally agree, we need to pick our workmates thoughtfully. And for me, this is something Bob and I do. We've collaborated for 30 years now. And when we pick collaborators, and we have a lot on a big study like this, we're not just interested in the knowledge they bring, the particular expertise that they bring, the techniques that they might allow us to do that we couldn't do without them. We're also interested in how much fun is it going to be to work with them? How generative is this relationship going to be? Are they a giver, or are they only interested in a transactional part of this relationship? And we've said no to folks that we don't think fit into those categories. They're not fun. They're not really giving. And they're not going to be generative. They're not going to create an atmosphere where we all feel more creative and thoughtful. So that's important in selection. And then as a leader, I think it's important that we create environments in which those values flourish. So takers don't get advantages. Givers might get advantage and attention. We value people that are generative and generous, that they help others. We talk about their contributions in that way. And we have fun, that we have to laugh. We have to have joy. So my parents, I'm going to go back to the beginning again. My parents, so different, felt like a cross-cultural experience, the two homes, but they shared one thing in common. They both enjoyed laughter. Growing up in my home, either home, you've heard people laugh. I probably have laughed once or twice in here, but people who know me, I have a loud laugh. It's hard to miss it. So we need to create places that are fun. And you alluded to Barbara Fredrickson's work. Her idea about broaden and build is important there. I think that positive emotions tend to broaden our cognitive fields. We think about more things and give us more flexibility. Negative emotions do the opposite. So those are some of my thoughts about the kinds of spaces and people we want to be with when we're leaders.
This is so true, Mark. I mean, every morning when we wake up, I think each one of us has the opportunity to pick the people that we want to spend time with, and to pick the activities that matter the most to our purpose and our life. So
Yep.
100% with you. And I've got this privilege to make that choice every morning when I wake up, which is wonderful. Now, almost shifting to the end, we're entering 2025, Mark. Could you share 3 actionable steps that leaders on this podcast, or listeners, or individuals can take to strengthen their relationship and as a result, of course, enhance their well-being and also their happiness?
Yep.
What should they do? 3 things they should do.
So I think the first piece is to recognize that if we believe, and I believe it deeply, that relationships are important for our health, emotional and physical, and they're also important for our productivity, that we need to figure out ways not just to fit them in or to tolerate them. They need to become part of our practice. Can you imagine? I talk about this all the time with my colleagues. Could you imagine teaching or training people to think about a business setting for your life?
Yep.
And finding that the people that you're training or teaching are difficult and hard to deal with and no fun. You have to figure out a way to make it fun. So yes. Students are endlessly entertaining, right? You just have to allow yourself not to worry about certain things and to come in with curiosity. And people in business and leadership positions need to figure out a way to be curious and interested in other people and to benefit from the things that they bring to the table and to create settings in which other people pay attention and value that. So, remembering birthdays, silly, but a nice thing, celebrating achievements, nice things, asking about people's families or, important achievements outside of work, bringing that into the work domain, I think is really important.
Love it.
I think the third thing I would say is probably about being intentional again, that it's so easy to get distracted by things that have real quantifiable nature, the bottom line, the number of, deals that were closed in a certain way, that we have to figure out a way to get on our dashboard, on our intentional sort of focus, the importance of relationships. So it's a good day for me when I've connected with at least one person in a meaningful way. That makes me feel good. At the end of the day, when I look back at my day and I do this, I think about, I wrote a few pages in a book I'm writing or in an article I'm writing. That's great. But boy, I had a great connection, in the morning, and that conversation I had, that was a great connection. So we need to bring that into the fore, bring it to our attention onto that kind of dashboard that our attention is focused on.
Awesome, Mark. So now, really almost closing it, as you know, this is a Positive Leadership podcast. So, of course, I got to ask you, given all the insights you've been building and keep building with a good life, how would you personally define a positive leader, Mark?
Yeah, so I think a positive leader is one who leverages, and I don't want to use it in the transactional way, but really takes advantage of the connections that they have with others. So that means helping people grow to their capacity, building on the talents that they had, but building on those relationships because they're the resources on which I think we make our greatest achievements. Not only do we want to build them, we want to enjoy them at the same time. So we have to figure out how we do both. And it depends on our personalities, what's going to be most exciting to us. But for me, understanding, connecting with people, those are those moments that I treasure. And that's a kind of North Star that we can use to guide ourselves, I think.
I love it, and reminds me of a wonderful quote from Clayton Christensen in a wonderful book called How Will You Measure Your Life? I'm sure you read that book as well, Mark. And I saw him actually at a conference. He was wonderful. And he said, the only metrics that will truly matter to my life are the individuals whom I have been able to help one by one to become better people.
Yeah.
That seems very...
Yeah,
that seems to resonate with everything you said.
It's beautiful. We asked folks late in their lives, in their 80s, if they had regrets. Everyone had regrets. More than 75% of the regrets were about relationships. So this is the opposite. People talked about wishing they had invested more in the relationships with people at work, wishing they had paid more attention to the fill in the blank, their wife, their husband, their children, their friends. So that's wisdom there that you were quoting. Yeah.
No, the very last question, I promise. Last one. If you could start distilling the wisdom of the good life into super hard question, one core takeaway for listeners, what would it be?
Yeah.
And what is the single most important learning you hope resonates with all of our listeners?
Yeah, so I think this is partly about behavior change. The lesson or the call that I want to make is about doing something now, right after they listen to this podcast. So connections are the key in our lives to our health, to our happiness, to our productivity. So think about someone that's important to you that you can reach out to right now. Maybe it's a text because you're busy, but you're going to let that person know that you're thinking about them. You listen to a show on the importance of connection, and they're one of your important connections. Let them know why and plan a time to see them next week. Do something with them. So time it's the urgency of time. Do it now. Reach out to that person you care about.
What a wonderful ending, Marc. It's not a call to action, it's a call to relationship. Real call to relationships. So Marc, thank you so much for your insights, for sharing this incredible finding of the Harvard study with us. And before we wrap up, let's remind our listeners that they can actually find a good life in all good bookstores and online, of course. And it's an amazing read, I must tell you, that I recommend to everyone, as it can truly change one's perspective into life. So to listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you the subscribe button so that you can actually don't miss upcoming episodes with incredible guests like Marc. And if today's discussion resonates with you, please take a moment just to leave me a review, just a short comment that you appreciate maybe that conversation, because your feedback is very valuable and it helps us grow and make better discussion, more insights with all of you. Thank you again, Marc, and for being part of this Positive Leadership podcast.
Such a pleasure, JP. It was such an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much.